figured it was time to tell my side of the story. The couple of guys were going to write other books. Matter of fact, they called me. They wanted, Peter Arnett wanted to interview me for a book he was doing with another fella. And I thought, geez, if these guys are going to be writing books, and they weren't even there at the start, it's time for me to get out the record once and for all. And tell you, I hated doing it. As I say in the book, I think he who can does, and he who can't writes about it. And I'm still looking for some way to get back in this business. But I wrote it anyway, and I'll have to take my chances, because I don't think news is being done in the right way. It's certainly not my dream of where CNN should have wound up now. And I'd like to have another chance in trying to make it happen different. Started, I guess, with Jerry Levin when he was running HBO. He called over one day and said they'd like to consider doing a 24-hour news network, and I was running the only independent news company in America, and he asked if we'd sell to him, and I said I'd love to, and we talked about it for a while. Then I took it to my board, and my board were all broadcasters, and they just said, no way. Cable is the enemy. We will not help cable. We will not let them use any of our material. Well, it was a company called Independent Television News Association. All the guys in it either were or represented independent television station owners, the Metro Medias of those days, the Chicago Tribune Company, and it was particularly Metro Media, regarded the cable industry with mortal fear. And the guy got up there and just said, I am not going to let them pee on my grave with my material. And I 9-0, the board votes. And so I go back and tell that to Jerry and to the other people I'm working with. And for a little bit, they think about doing it themselves. And they talk with me, and I give them consultants and this and that. And then the point man, the guy I'm working with, one day gets a call from Jerry early in the morning, and Jerry says, I've just stepped out of the shower, and I always get my best thoughts in the shower, and we're not going to do this. 15 years later, the point man's wife tells me the story and says, if I were Jerry Levin, I'd never take a shower again. This was 77, maybe early 78, in New York. The group produced out of New York, and I was commuting down here to Washington because we had about 8-9 people working for us, and we had 2 major bureaus, New York and Washington, and the rest of the world we covered either with news agencies or individual television stations who became corresponding stations who would take our material and give us access to theirs in return. It was kind of like the Associated Press. That's who we modeled ourselves after. It was not for profit, and the members were the people who owned the stations, and a lot of network stations learned that we could deliver material faster than the networks, and these are network affiliated, and so they would help us. We had some of the best stations in the U.S. in those days who would be our partners, just because we were willing to give them material that the networks always held back for their prime time, for their 7 o'clock main news program. In my standard, then, the networks were just the big 3, NBC, CBS, and ABC. And in those days, they were the only way of getting national news or any kind of national programming. They really controlled the eyeballs of everybody in the United States. You saw what they showed you, and if you didn't like it, there was no place else to go. They treated me and the other independent stations in general as upstarts, poor relations, trying to chisel our way in on their business. There was no atmosphere of courtesy involved. We weren't even honorable competitors. We were guys that they wanted to stamp into the ground, and that's good. I mean, if you believe in the little guy and you like being David against Goliath, there's no better spur than having these big guys trying to shove you out of the business. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, which is then a city in the shadow of New York, and you're always an underdog when you come from Newark because you look over at the other side of the river, and those are the big guys. It was a typical, I guess, middle-class Jewish family. We were comfortable enough to never plead poverty. Lived in when I grew up and lived in a very, very mixed neighborhood, the kind of neighborhood you rarely see these days. And there were people on the block where I lived this is in the 30s, who of German descent, who'd put on Bund uniforms and march up to the parks and root for Hitler. And then there were also people on the block of British descent who'd put out British flags on their days. And it was pretty conservative, though. I can remember the kids on the block in the 1936 election, you know, chanting, you know, rah, 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 land in the White House, rah, 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 Roosevelt's in the outhouse, ha, ha, ha. And it was, you know, we were kids. Everybody was politically aware. Everybody knew what side you were on. There were real issues. So you grew up with politics. That was part of your life. And the city itself of Newark was an old-fashioned machine kind of city. And so you grew up with that knowledge of local politics, where elections were rigged and stolen, and votes, you know, the guy who counted the votes always made sure he won. You know, this ward and that ward would suddenly appear with 3,000 extra votes, and this guy would become mayor. It was a wonderful way to learn what real life was about. And again, you know, for some reason, I guess Newark always made you feel like you were being kicked around by somebody or other. Well, my mom, you know, she was at home. I had a brother and a sister, and she just always with us. And my father was a partner in a glass company in downtown New York, an old company. Had been in business so started in 1847, and they manufactured mirrors and scientific glass, and they sold all sorts of plain glass and that kind of stuff. It was good business, and he did reasonably well. It was tough during the Depression. He was supporting his own family, my mother's family, everyone else, because he was the guy who had the job and the income. But after that, you know, when the war came and people were doing well, it was just very comfortable. I went to good schools. All my brother and sister did too. So it's but everywhere you went, at least if you were my age, you remembered the Depression, you remembered the hard times, and I was always the anti-guy. When I went to college in a very liberal era, I was an arch conservative. You know, just I guess I'm a contrarian. No, I consider myself as pure a newsman as there can be, and I'll go where the story takes me. And I'd always like to put some angle on the story that gives it originality. So there is a point of view, and it's just as likely to be a conservative point of view as a liberal point of view, but it's got to be different from what the other guys are saying. 53, government, political science. Went to Harvard to Harvard Law School, where I managed to get kicked out in about 8 or 9 months. All my life, I was a gambler. I loved to play cards, and at Harvard, I didn't go to too many classes, which isn't unusual. People at Harvard Law School, there are some people who never go to class and do very well. They just read all the books and buy lecture notes, and they wind up doing very well. But I made the great mistake of telling a guy I thought was a friend of mine, a teaching assistant, about how I was living. Well, he knew, because he and I were hanging out together, and he felt that he had to tell the dean about it. And the dean was Dean Griswold, who later became Solicitor General of the United States. And the dean was a very sober, literally a prohibitionist. You couldn't get a drink at his house, and very puritanical. And he despised the thought that somebody could get out of Harvard without going to class, and somebody could gamble at Harvard. He even sent the vice dean over to raid my dorm room to see if I was running roulette wheels and gambling there. But in any event, I didn't even finish the first year. He sent me home over a spring vacation. But you know, Ted got kicked out of Brown, I got kicked out of Harvard Law School, and we managed to find some rehabilitation at CNN. I was talking to one of the people who used to work for me at CNN, a woman named Chris Chase, a great writer herself, who writes biographies, and we were just talking, and the words came tumbling out of her mouth, I think, and I said, "That's the title," or they came tumbling out of my mouth, and she said, "That's the title," and all of a sudden that was the title for the book. Ted didn't like the networks in those days. I didn't like them. We were fighting with AT&T because they were, again, on the side of the big guys. We had to beat them. The White House didn't want to let us into to cover the story. So everybody, we're taking on President Reagan, AT&T, the networks, and the establishment press. You know, this thing couldn't be done, and if it could be done, we were the wrong guys to do it, and it was going to be amateurish, and it would look awful, and I loved it. Everybody was against us, and we had to do it together, and it was me and Ted against the world. And maybe, in fairness, it should have been Ted and me, but he's taken first billing so long, I thought I'd take it on the book. I would think I was trying, because there's a paragraph there too where I say what Ted did, and I think I had to differentiate my role from Ted's, because Ted had an enormous role, but it wasn't in the editorial part, the building of the business itself. For him, he was building the empire in which this would be one jewel. He was cable before cable was cool. I can say it more simply now by just saying he knew cable and I knew news, and it was a perfect combination, because that was what you had to have to make it work. Part of what I didn't say, what part of the things that were against us, part of that world, were the unions. For years, they had dominated the industry, and there was no way you would be able to do 24-hour news if you had to pay union wages and have crews that had too many people on it. And you know, every time an anchor, a man appeared on camera, he got a $75 appearance fee or something, and that kind of stuff. It was that kind of a setup that made competition impossible. So the networks never fought the system. They could pay those rates, and that was a classic bar to competition between the high rates that you had to pay for lines and to get your video around, and the high rates the employees demanded by union rules. No one could have competed with them, and so we had to go in and fight with that, and we had a whole new system. When I came down there, film was still being used to cover news. It was waning, but it was still being there, and I wouldn't permit a piece of film equipment in the place. We were going to be taped because that was the way tape was going. And we created, as it says there, the first computerized newsroom. It's probably the first computerized part of any business, a full business, and we just did it. It's like Orson Welles. When he went out to Hollywood, this is what he said. It wasn't as if he was such a genius, but all the technologies that had been developed that the studios wouldn't put on because they had too much money invested in the old technology, we were starting fresh. We could start with everything that was new, and that made CNN. Now, average maybe 300 to 350,000 people watch it an hour. Yeah, but, you know, on an average hour, average 15 minutes. Yeah. Well, on a monthly cum, which is the best that I could give you, they say they cum about 30%. So it's 30% of 80 million. So it means homes. Yeah, 24 million homes will be watching CNN for 6 minutes at least once a month. I think they're a disgrace. I think that certainly you should have more than half the people in the country looking at you for 6 minutes of something. You should be so important that no one should be able to spend a whole month without catching you at one time or another. And as for the size of the audience, when I left CNN, we had one rating point in the universe of about 15 million, which meant we had 150,000 people watching us back in 1982. The cable universe has multiplied now 5 times, and they only have twice as many people watching it. That doesn't work. Something's wrong. Well, I think they got self-satisfied. By the time I left, we were getting rave reviews. We had this rating which was higher than we'd ever had before, this one rating, and people thought it must be going good. Let's leave it the way it is. And that's always very dangerous. And we started news at 6 a.m. We were the first people ever do it, and people didn't believe anybody would watch. When I got the first ratings in that spring and winter of '82, we were beating 2 of the 3 networks. In homes where we appeared, we were beating CBS or NBC. At that time, Good Morning America was the leader, because we started at 6, and the people would stay with us until 9 o'clock in the morning. Just as I was leaving, a month after I got fired, ABC and NBC bring their news back to 6. They start at 6. CBS did it in the September of that year. They didn't even make the elementary move of saying, let's move ours to 5 if they're going to 6. And when you stay there, if you're ahead and other people are moving to catch up, you better keep moving on, because if you stay the same, they're going to catch up and maybe pass you. Well, Ted, questions about Ted. I mean, Ted is still a star, and they'd like to know about it. And then there are a lot of questions about, am I just doing this to get back? Is this like sour grapes? And I try to make it clear. I think I treat Ted very well in the book. I know I do that. And for the rest, no, I'm disappointed in CNN. It hasn't gone where I wanted it to go. And my reason to do the book is I didn't want to have a mythology left behind that said, this is the way you've got to do 24-hour news, and this is where it's going to wind up, with so much news talk, which is where you're talking about news rather than showing news. CNN was created to show news, to show it warts and all. You know, if you have somebody with a mop walking across the screen, I didn't care about that, because that was what was happening in the newsroom, and it could work. The idea, there were two basic ideas, and they sound very highfalutin. If this was a French television station, I'd be the darling of it right now, because I'm going to use two words. What is a Frank Zappa word, which is randomonium, which is like the chaos theory. I believe the world is constantly in chaos. There are things happening in it all day long, all over, and mostly it's just happening. There aren't cause and effect to everything that happens in the world. And if we could cover that and be live with that from all over the world all day long, and then for 2 hours, from 8 to 10 at night, we had Prime News 120, and that was going to take all the news we gathered all day and put it in some kind of context and make give some order to this disorderly world, and then follow that with a program from 10 to 11. We're going to pick the most important story, which would have been developed, and have one guy sitting in that studio, or a woman, and it was a woman, to talk to the lead players in that story, and then take calls from people. It's the first national call-in show, and let the people talk to the people who were part of the story. And I thought that was kind of the perfect all-over schedule, and it worked also for another key reason. The news is often not very interesting, but no one knows when the most interesting thing in the world is going to happen. And if you keep moving from story to story and keep telling them, we had an interview with the New York Times where the New York Times was, this was before he got on there, was putting down the idea of CNN, and I said we were going to be live, and their editor said, well, aren't you going to cover an awful lot of one-alarm fires? And the answer was simple. Yeah, until the fire's over. How do you know whether it's a one-alarm fire until the fire that burns down Chicago? And that, I wanted that feeling. And then the second idea was what the French would now call deconstructionism, where you show the process of doing the things. News is certainly not always interesting, but the process of getting the news is very interesting. And if you made the process of gathering, if you showed that, if you had this open newsroom, which we created there, where you could see everybody and see them working, and if you turned your assignment editors, which we did in the beginning, really into tellers of stories. What are you going to be going after? What are your crews doing now? What's on your list? People could stay with you all day long just to find out whether you delivered on what you promised. You were going to give them something at 8:30. Did you have it by 11, or didn't you have it at all? I was trying to give people reasons to stay with CNN, to watch it, to get involved both ways. One, in what was happening all over the world, and two, what was happening in our own shop. If I had been there long enough, I hope I would have created characters who would have become important to people. They would like, you know, will Joe get this story? Can Samantha come up with that? And you know, with that kind of thing, maybe you could have had 4 rating points rather than the 0.4s they have now. Well, it was over Sandy and over Pat Buchanan. I'd hired Sandy. I'd hired her because Whitcover wrote a terrific column about her. I remember, she asked Teddy Kennedy, when Teddy Kennedy was running against Carter in the 80 primaries, he did an interview with her. She was a softball interview. She was just this, you know, kind of softball soft woman on a local news station in Chicago, WLS, and it was just a soft interview. And she asked him about the Joan factor. And the Joan factor was that he, well, at that time, he hadn't been treating, people thought he might not have been treating his wife all that well. And his stock answer was, well, Joan's sick, she's been doing this, she's been doing that. And she wouldn't let him off the hook. She stayed with him for 8, 10, 12 minutes, all the way, and he walked off furious at her, angry, and Whitcover wrote a column about it. She had more guts than any other of these so-called news professionals. So we called her in. I looked at that Kennedy tape, and she was terrific. She was dogged, and so we hired her on the basis of her, what looked like the edge and the urge. But it turned out that she really liked soft interviews. She liked to interview stars and celebrities, and she didn't much like playing hardball with people, and she didn't, and I thought she was the best interviewer of ordinary human beings, just people who had stories to tell that I've ever seen, you know, in Oprah's league with that. But she didn't like doing that either. So after 2 years, and she wasn't careful sometimes in picking up on what her guests said, and we had a couple of complaints from people. I just thought it was time for her to leave, and I let her go. Her husband-to-be was her agent, and he got to Ted, and he convinced Ted that she should stay. But in the meantime, to replace her, I had hired Pat Buchanan and Tom Braden, who were then on WRC Radio, in a brand new format that we called Crossfire. And Ted didn't like that. He called them, he identified them as my turkeys, and we had a pretty big battle over that. And he didn't even, if they hadn't had a contract with me, they would not have gotten the job. Ted said he was going to pay him off. They said they were going to go to court anyway because I promised them this prime time hour, and they settled on a compromise where Ted put him on originally at 11:30, and then he moved him back down to 7:30, where they are to this day. And the closest Ted ever came to an apology was one day, was at lunch, and a couple of years later, and he walked up to me and he said, "Crossfire is our number one's on the network." And they turned around and walked away from me. But I thought, coming from Ted, that was okay and really quite gracious. It was just, he was conned. Ted didn't know much about the way broadcasting really works. For anybody who's in the business, that listening to agents is one of the things that is nothing you should really do, because agents have their own interests always. But so it was tough. I thought I was just beginning to get it right. More importantly, I thought CNN was just beginning to get it right. And maybe that's why I wrote the book, because if we had progressed that way, I think CNN would be different. I think world news would be somewhat different than it is now. We were just on the way. Yeah, I was worried that I could go too far, and I tried very much not to. I mean, this is not a tell-all book. It's a tell-something book, and maybe tell only a quarter of what you know book. I mean, there are lots of other stories. I put in stories that I thought defined character and were important to the news process. I didn't throw in gossip for gossip's sake, I don't think, anywhere. I recall this is when it was even before CNN. This was when he was selling advertising for TBS. And Ted, despite his bravado, is not the most secure person in the world. And he sometimes does outrageous things, I think, out of a sense of not being in control. This woman represented one of the largest advertising accounts in the world. She was very powerful and very important. Her father was a distinguished broadcaster himself. And when Ted was talking to her, approached her, he grabbed her by the chest, and everybody stopped. And it was very strange. Ted himself afterwards was somewhat abashed, but that company never bought a bit of advertising from Ted. And I think of that in connection with other stories where Ted is not in control, where he has a boss in the room. He will do an outrageous thing just to prove how much power he has. No matter, you may be his boss, you may be more powerful than he is, but he will not lie down to you. He will do something far more than he would do to somebody ordinarily, just because that person has great power over him. This was at a meeting with Cox people. We were talking to the assembled Cox general managers, and Cox is a very important cable company, and he was trying to sell him. And he said, at the end of his sale, after making all the pitch that he could, he said, "Remember, we are always going to be on your side. We are cable, you are cable, and when issues come up," and I'm saying it more clearly than he did, but he said, "We will always be on your side." And I followed that. I had to get up after that and say him, just to confirm our news integrity, and I just said that, look, we will always be on your side when you're in the right, but we're going to play everything fair and square and down the middle. We're not going to be on anybody's side permanently. It was just another piece about, too much violence on television. What can we do about it? And it was not the most important hearing in the world. And he called me from Washington late at night, as I say, slurring his words a little bit. And suddenly he wanted the live coverage all of a sudden. And I made the mistake of saying to him, I don't think it can be done. It's too late. Let's forget it. And I called the people in Washington who were working for me and said, make sure it can't be done. He called them, and they called special people to come in early in the morning, and they put in a special line to the hearing room so that they could have him up there. And I was flying up to New York or Washington that day, so I wasn't aware of it till I landed that morning. And that was the morning where there was a very important moment. The Brinks robbery had occurred in Westchester the day before, and this was the last act of violence by the left, radical left in the U.S. And they had killed 2 or 3 cops, and they'd stolen millions of dollars. And at the time, the night before, nobody had known whether that was John Dillinger or what it was. By the next morning, it was clear that it was a political act, that a lot of the people who did it were relatively famous political activists, and it was a major story. And Mary Alice Williams, who was then running our New York bureau, was trying to get on the air to tell that story. And the guy in our bureau chief in Washington was just refusing to let her get on the air because he had been ordered by Ted to keep this hearing up until whenever it ended. And when I got off the plane, I called him and said, take it down. He said, well, Ted said. And I said, I'm your boss. I'll take the heat, take the hearing down. And Mary Alice got up, and she was able to tell the story and run it through the rest of the day as developments occurred and where it wound up. But it was just a lot of this was a question of who was in control of the network. Was it Ted or was it me? And I thought, and our deal was, we shook hands on it, that I would control format, content, and personnel. Ted would control business and the advertising and public relations and everything else. I mean, Ted is he's a one-man business machine. And it was at moments like this where he decided that he could go on the air, or what went on the air, that I felt I had to stand up for myself and for the whole business. In '92, just when I was beginning to work on the Food Network, Ted sought me out at the Kate's dinner, a big cable event, and offered me the job back. And at '92, this is September. And I told him that I had just shaken hands with a couple of people at the Providence Journal who were the partners in the Food Network. I told him I couldn't, that I'd given my word to these guys, and it was an easy way out. I would have had to think about it. And then, several years later, like '96, '97, I'd become comfortable financially and in my life. I'd done most of the things I wanted to do, and was desperate to get back in the news business. I've loved news, and I wanted to come back at a low-level job, medium-level job in news. And I called Ted. I didn't want to report to Ted. There had to be somebody, maybe 3 or 4 somebodies between me and Ted. So then I could be like all the rest of the grunts, just laugh at the jerks for what they did and what they had to do. It's a great, when you don't have responsibility, when you're just one of the grunts, it's wonderful to be able to laugh at the people who have to go up there and talk to the big bosses and try to explain what they're doing and why it works. And I went down to Atlanta and tried to do that. The people who were running, I talked to Ted, and he said, he was satisfied now with the people. He remembered '92, and I said, no, I'm not looking for a big job. I just want a middling, ordinary job. And he said, talk to Tom Johnson, who was running the company. And I went down, I talked with Tom for a while, and I couldn't keep my mouth shut. Tom asked for advice about what to do here and what to do there, and I should have said, I'm not going to answer any of those policy questions. You want to ask me what story we should cover tomorrow or how to produce a piece? Because that's what I want to do. But we got into be talking about big and important things, and the discussion went on probably too long, and Tom said, he said, Ted says he could never control you. Will I be able to control you? And I said, sure, I want to be controlled. I'm coming down here to do ordinary work, but I don't think they ever bought it. And he offered me doing some consulting work on a project that I later did with the New York Times, and I didn't think I wanted to bring that as a consultant. I didn't want to bring that to anyone. I hadn't even been invited back to the 10th anniversary, and I've kind of been written out of the history of CNN. My friends would go down there and say they've got these pictures up and down the hall and everything, and your picture's nowhere there. And I've felt like this forgotten man, but I was there for the 20th anniversary, and you go down there, and I discover they can't even spell my name right, and and when Tom Johnson nicely enough, when I'm sitting down there at the back of the room with the breakfast, announces that I'm there, and he doesn't quite pronounce it right either. And the nicest thing about it was Ted, at that time, was very aware of the book, and he kept asking me about it. When was it coming out? Could he read it? And that kind of stuff. So that was pleasant. But for the most part, well, I'm not going to kid you or myself. For the most part, it was very, very sad for me, partially ego, but also to see the way that they were carrying on. It was awful for CNN, too. By the time we got there, the 20th anniversary, the press was discovering that the Emperor had no ratings, that there was that CNN's ratings were way down. It wasn't this phenomenal machine that people had thought it was. I hope either they'll change, or that whoever starts the next news network starts it with an idea that you could do it in a different way. I don't know. He made a very nice statement saying he appreciated my contributions to the beginnings of CNN. And I say now, when people ask me about him, I appreciate his contributions to the beginning of CNN too. But there have been no other comments. And I got a note from Tom Johnson with his reaction. I don't think I think that was too personal. I don't think I want to really, if he ever wants to talk about it, that'll be fine. A good friend of mine, a man whose opinions I really respect, was around CNN in the beginning of it, said that I was too tough on Tom, too easy on Burt Reinhardt, and right on Ed Turner. Burt is not a villain in the book, which probably made this guy think I was too easy on him, but Burt was my mentor. I had worked for Burt Reinhardt from the first day I came into the news business. He was at Movietone News and then United Press Movietone News, and when that company closed, he went to Paramount Pictures, and I brought him back into the news business to be my number two. And then he took CNN over after I left. And I had great respect for him as a news professional. And he was tough on people because he had to save money. And but he had a great sense of news. May not have been an original, but he was a great matcher. If somebody else had the news, he wanted to match it, and he would work on that very hard. And he could save money, but he was very conservative, not talking politically, in the way he covered news. He didn't get CNN into any trouble. There were no big libel suits, no disgraces while he was there. He was succeeded by Tom Johnson, who is now still the chairman of CNN. And Johnson is a man who had worked in the press office, assistant press secretary under Lyndon Johnson, had been a publisher of the LA Times under Mr. Chandler, but he was never a newsman himself. And he is an amateur. He's a very, very nice guy. Everybody loves him. But he knows, forgive him, he knows not what he does not work for me. He was running this company, and he was supposed to know what he did, and he left CNN on, I think, two journalistically disgraceful things. In a Noriega case, when Emmanuel Noriega was being tried as a drug dealer in the U.S., he played some tapes of conversations between Noriega and a lawyer, which wound up, he lost a couple of lawsuits about it, and it was disgraceful that he did it. There's no reason to do it. That's a lawyer-client privilege. It's going to raise major issues, and there was nothing in the news in that tape that was worth playing. Even the judge afterwards said there was nothing harmful to anybody in it, and they were just doing it to prove, trying to be a big boy, trying to show who's bigger. And then Tailwind was absolutely a disgrace, where they cover a story they should never have covered. The reporters do their best and a decent job, and I think Peter Arnett did his best, and whether or not that was good enough to go on the air is a decision that Tom Johnson had to make, and he decided it was good enough to go on the air. And then when it's done and the world comes down on him and the Pentagon comes down on him, he fires all the people who actually worked on it, and he walks away scot-free. And I was talking to Ollie North yesterday, and it's like in the Marines. If you got a lieutenant and you send him into battle and it doesn't work out, and the colonel and the major and everybody's approved the plan, and he walks away with casualties, you fire him, and the colonel and the major go on to be generals. In any event, I just thought that Tom, as nice as he is, was a wrong man for that job. And it reflected an attitude, something I don't say in the book, which is especially true in print companies like Time Magazine and others who now run so much television. It's an attitude, oh, it's good enough for television. It doesn't matter. It's only television is their word. They would not, Time magazine would not have tolerated either Noriega or Tailwind if it had been done by an editor of Time, somebody who worked in print. Well, Ed Turner was a guy that I've known for a long, long time. He used to be first as a client, and then I got him a job at UPITN when Metro Media, and he came to disagree. And after that, he did some work first with CBS, then with some local stations. And when we were starting CNN, he had again fallen on hard times, and I hired him again and brought him over. And he was not the hardest working man in the world, and I never thought he was great for CNN, but he had there were people that I liked who talked about giving him another chance, that it was time for a mitzvah, that I would earn a mitzvah, a blessing, if I had brought him in. And he's a nice, he's a witty, funny man, Ed Turner, and he did the 2-minute news for us. It was a wonderful little program that he did. The best thing he should have done, we should have stayed on air and stayed doing that little insert. People still talk to me about that and how good it was. But as a boss, he's not always around when he has to be, and he has. Well, I don't want to knock him here. Let's just say I would not have made him the number 2 at CNN when I left. After Ted fired me, he kept the job open for 6 months. They wanted me to come back, so he was very careful about who was going to replace me. And there were 3 or 4 candidates, and he asked who should get it, and I said Burt Reinhardt. And he said, well, he asked me if I would mind if he named Ed Turner Burt's number 2. He said he didn't know Burt too well, but he and Ed got along. And I said, no, I wouldn't mind that. And I think I say in the book, because I felt that with Burt around at CNN would never get too bad, and with Ed Turner would never get too good. And then in his time there, Ed, that's really the way it worked out. They lost about 30% of their ratings immediately after I left. But then they stayed there. They stayed at a 0.7 rating for a long time. I guess the whole world knows, or our world knows what Bernie is, but Bernie has tremendous credibility, tremendous sincerity, tremendous integrity. He's very smart, but there are a lot of guys who are smart, but he won't compromise his smarts. On the day that, I think this is the day that made us, and for American television viewers, was on the day that Reagan was shot, and Bernie was sitting there in the anchor seat. He's acting as managing editor as well as anchor, because when you're live, the man who's doing the talking is the managing editor. And where he's sitting there in the chair, and all of a sudden he gets a call from a reporter, and we're the first one with this news. Ronald Reagan had in fact been shot. At first people thought they missed him. He was in the hospital. It's news talk. They've given up on news, and all they want to do is talk about news. And it's the worst kind of imitation. We're imitating something that isn't even really working. Fox has done a terrific job with news talk. I think Roger Ailes is a genius at news talk, and they've turned out some very good shows in that prime time talking about news. They have attitude. Their anchors are good. I think they're better than the people you just mentioned, with the possible exception of Larry King, who's got a style of his own. And when CNN sees that their numbers are getting so good, CNN thinks, oh, gee, we've got to be doing just what they're doing. So we're going to imitate them, and we're going to put on different varieties of talk. If there's now only 1 hour of hard news there. Brian Williams on MSNBC does the only hour of hard news in all of prime time on all the 3 supposedly all-news networks. CNN has more bureaus, more reporters, more information all over the world than either of the other 2 networks. I would be taking advantage of that, and I would be doing hard news. I'd be doing it from all over the world during prime time, and I'd take my lumps in the ratings until I got it established, until I made people aware of what we were doing and created the new stars, the new Christiane Amanpours of others, people who report from the battlefield, not sitting around and arguing behind a desk. I got to say, I'd be hiring Bill Clinton right now. I mean, if I was there, I'd be offering Bill Clinton any amount of money to have him do that show that I described. That's the Sandy Freeman show. if he was in that seat now, and we were picking out the main news story of the day, Bill could get anybody. When we say the most important player, we'd get it, and people would watch. Every newspaper would have to report on it the next morning, and we would be moving up news half a cycle. It's the easy answer. meandted.com is a website that's attempting to make the book like CNN, flowing, constantly going news, constantly working with the with what's happening. The book is dead on November 24th. As we sit here now, it's late in February, it's months later. All sorts of things have happened. President Bush has become president. CNN, Time Warner, has merged with AOL. Ted has moved, since I wrote that book, Ted has moved his office out of Turner Broadcasting. He's got a company now called Turner Enterprises, where he sits upstairs in the same building. And it's sad, it's final. Both Ted and I now are standing there pressing our noses against the window, watching our baby from outside. It's been, I know it's got to be hard for Ted. It's hard for me. 400 people were fired. Ted would never have fired those people. I don't think Ted understood CNN, but he loved it, and he would. He would have found some other way to handle this than firing 400 people just because the new owners said, we got to save $1 billion. We got to cut costs all across the board. I tell those stories on the internet. I report day by day. I've got the latest ratings in my pocket now for last week, and CNN caught up on Fox just a little bit, which sounds good. And then I discovered that, of course, last week included Iraq Day on Friday, and on Friday CNN beat both of their networks combined, so the rest of the week they're still lagging. But it's like, I call television the great democracy, where people vote with their eyeballs. And by getting the ratings every week or every month, I can tell you the tally. It's like I'm tallying election seats, and you know what people are voting for, which one of the networks. Well, because all the people we talked to, everybody we interviewed, talked about it. It was an integral part of the young people at CNN, even some of the older guys I learned. But I didn't know it at the time. The most I knew about drugs was some guys in Atlanta were arrested at 3, 4 in the morning, and we had to bail them out and get them out of jail. And everybody called Pat with every problem. Pat ran the back room for the network. She taught all these people that came in on a program where they were called video journalists, fresh out of school. We gave them 90 days revolving job. Each job they'd handle for 90 days, and they'd discover whether they were a writer or a camera operator or a field cameraman or an editor or whatever it was. Pat ran that, and Pat also ran the editing department, where the work came through and was put on the air. These are editing tapes, because but she was there for all these young people. They couldn't make the rent, Pat helped them make their rent. If they couldn't find a roommate, Pat would find the roommate. If they ran into some kind of trouble, whether it was drinking or anything else, Pat would do what she had to. She'd call parents. And everybody loved her. When we came back for that 20th anniversary, she was the star, not me. All her kids crowding around her, telling her, it's like a brother coming back, how many kids I have, what they've done, what their successes were. It was wonderful for her and wonderful to be around. And I didn't know much myself about the drugging. I learned about that afterwards. Just in the process of writing this book, I learned that the drug suppliers to the news industry in both Washington and New York were people who worked at CNN 20 years ago, the guys who managed to get the stuff and had the other networks would send people over, motorcycle couriers over, to pick up their stash from CNN. If you know that, if I'd known that, it wouldn't have happened. But it couldn't know everything, and I think that was something I wouldn't have wanted to know. There hasn't been any. I mean, at least I haven't heard any complaints from anyone. I don't think anyone is about that kind of stuff. The only reaction has been to when I report the bad ratings. Then CNN goes a little nutso. But otherwise, most of the stories that I reveal were told to me by the people I'm talking about, and none of them said, "Don't write that about me. This is off the record." Everything here was said into tape machines on the record. My contract with the Food Network gave me 50 days a year to devote to other projects. And I was trying to bring BBC in a different form to the United States. I thought, this was before Fox and before MSNBC, I thought America could use another network and a news network with another point of view, and perhaps a more serious network than CNN had become. And a couple of cable owner brothers had come to me for years and have been trying to do this. And finally, we had convinced the BBC that now was the time and that they should back us. And so we joined with them. And then, just as I announced it, just as we're going to do it, the two cable owner brothers decide that it was perhaps not the thing for them. And they declined to put forward the financing that we had needed, which the stuff they had said they were prepared to put in and even sign contracts to do. News 12 was the first 24-hour local news network where you show things that are happening all over your whatever region it was. Long Island was a terrific place because it had no television stations of its own, and we owned that island. When I left there, I only was there for a couple of years, it was running like 5-1 ahead of them. It beats them now. It's in New York City, where Time Warner owns News One. News One has, within the city itself, has more ratings than all the 5 national networks combined. CNBC, MSNBC, CNN, Fox, and Headline News are still about 0.2 of a rating point less than Fox than local news has. Well, I'm only guessing, but I would assume it's somewhere between about $400 million, roughly, I guess, per year to run all the various radio stuff and the online stuff and all their various farm networks. Well, yeah, I think they take in somewhere, I think, between $700 and $800 million a year, and they probably spend about $500 million because I think they show a profit of, or they used to show a profit of between $200 and $300 million a year. What's happened is the networks, to compete, one of them, this is a CNN effect on television, the networks have been forced to release national and international stories to their local stations because Ted created a great thing called CNN News Source, which sold our news to local television stations all around the country. And that meant that the networks wanted to protect their own ratings by saying nobody will show news, national or international news until we do. And so they wouldn't give the local stations those stories as part of their deal. We gave them to them. The networks then had to give them to them. So most people can get the 2 or 3 top national, international stories a day, which is all I care about, in 25, 15-second bites as part of their local news. That's really killed the hard news portion of the network news because they're not revealing anything anymore. All they're telling you is stories you've already heard in your on your local news. So they go to fill that gap. They go tabloid. They go soft. None of them say your anchors have got to be so smart, or your anchor should have this many years of experience as a correspondent. It's what they look like and how many stories they tell, and it's pure formulaic. So without that, you've got CNN, and somehow CNN doesn't make news exciting anymore. Well, I do watch 1/2 hour of network news every night, and it could be any one of these. It could be Jennings or Brokaw, and occasionally even Rather. But when it comes to this kind of the 24-hour news, is I started out during the post-election period watching CNN, and then I found myself switching over to MSNBC and sampling Fox every once in a while to the, as I say in the book, over that 37-day period, CNN lost about 25% of its viewers, and the other 2 networks picked them up. And I reacted just like the other viewers. I found myself disappointed and not needing CNN. I got good, hard, factual news from MSNBC and great opinions from Fox.